The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 2 years. David rolled over in his tiny apartment bedroom, feeling the familiar ache in his back from the cheap mattress he couldn't afford to replace. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's TV already blaring the morning news. Another day, another struggle. At 34, David looked older than his years. The stress lines around his eyes told the story of a man who had been forced to grow up fast after losing his wife in a car accident. Now it was just him and his 2 kids, 8-year-old Sophie and 6-year-old Tommy. Every single day felt like climbing a mountain with no peak in sight. He shuffled to the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The same routine he'd followed for months. Check the bills on the counter. Count the money in his wallet. Calculate how many hours he'd need to work this week just to keep the lights on. The math never seemed to add up the way he wanted it to. Sophie appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school in clothes that were getting too small for her growing frame. She was mature for her age, something that both broke David's heart and made him proud. No 8-year-old should have to worry about whether Daddy had enough money for lunch money, but Sophie did. "Morning, Dad," she said quietly, grabbing the cereal box from the counter. She'd learned to make breakfast for herself and Tommy without being asked. "Tommy's still sleeping." David ruffled her hair and forced a smile. "Thanks, sweetheart. You're the best helper a dad could ask for." The truth was, David worked 2 jobs just to keep their heads above water. During the day, he operated machinery at the local packaging plant. The work was hard, repetitive, and paid just enough to cover rent and basic expenses. At night, he stocked shelves at the grocery store until midnight. By the time he got home, the kids were usually asleep, and he'd collapse into bed only to start the cycle again a few hours later. He'd tried everything to make their situation better. Applied for better jobs, looked into going back to school, even considered moving to a cheaper area. But with no college degree and 2 young children depending on him, his options felt limited. The factory job came with health insurance, which was more than many places offered. He couldn't risk losing that safety net. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion or even the constant worry about money. It was watching his kids grow up without really being there for them. Sophie had learned to help Tommy with his homework because David was usually at his second job. They'd learned to entertain themselves in the evenings because Daddy was too tired to play. Family movie nights had become a luxury they couldn't afford, both in time and money. That Tuesday morning started like any other. David dropped the kids at school, went to work at the factory, and spent 8 hours watching boxes move down conveyor belts. His mind wandered during those hours, usually to practical things like whether the car would pass its inspection next month or if he could afford to buy Sophie new shoes before her current ones completely fell apart. Around lunchtime, his phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, and David almost didn't answer. Spam calls were just another annoyance in his already complicated life. But something made him pick up on the 3rd ring. "Is this David Johnson?" The voice was professional, formal. "Yeah, that's me." "Who's calling?" "This is Attorney Williams from Patterson Law Firm in Billings, Montana. I'm calling about your great-uncle Harold." David paused, trying to place the name. Harold. He had a vague memory of meeting an older man at a family gathering when he was maybe 10 years old. A quiet guy who lived somewhere out west and didn't talk much to the rest of the family. David hadn't thought about him in decades. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Harold Johnson passed away 3 years ago," the lawyer continued. 3 years ago. Why are you calling me now?" "Well, sir, there were some complications with the estate. Legal issues that we've finally resolved. The thing is, Mr. Johnson named you as his sole beneficiary." David nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "You've inherited your great-uncle's property. It's a farmhouse on 80 acres in rural Montana." The rest of the conversation felt like a dream. David learned that Harold had been a recluse who lived alone on his property for decades. There were no other living relatives who could claim the inheritance. The property had been tied up in legal proceedings because of some zoning issues, but those had finally been sorted out. "What kind of condition is the property in?" David asked, already imagining the possibilities. Maybe he could sell it and finally get ahead financially. The lawyer paused. "Well, Mr. Johnson, I have to be honest with you. The property needs significant work. The house hasn't been maintained in years, and there are some complications." What kind of complications? There are substantial back taxes owed, and the house itself requires major repairs. Your uncle apparently had some unusual hobbies that left the property in a rather unique state. David's heart sank a little, but he tried to stay optimistic. Even a rundown property might be worth something. Land was land, right? How much are we talking about for the back taxes? Around $8,000 annually. They've been accumulating since your uncle's death. David did quick math in his head. $24,000 in back taxes plus whatever repairs the house needed. Still, 80 acres of land had to be worth something, even in the middle of nowhere. That evening, David sat his kids down at their small kitchen table. Sophie was helping Tommy with his reading homework while David heated up frozen dinners in the microwave. It wasn't the healthiest meal, but it was what they could afford. "Kids, I got some interesting news today," he said, setting their plates down. "Remember how I told you about family members we don't see very often?" Tommy looked up from his book. "Like Grandma and Grandpa in Florida?" "Sort of. Well, it turns out I had a great uncle named Harold who lived far away. He passed away and he left us his house." Sophie's eyes widened. "A whole house? Like we could live there?" "Maybe," David said carefully. He didn't want to get their hopes up too high. "It's in Montana, which is really far from here, and the house needs a lot of work." "Is Montana where cowboys live?" Tommy asked excitedly. David laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in weeks. "Some cowboys, I guess. It's definitely different from here." That night, after the kids were asleep, David sat at his laptop researching Montana property values and looking up pictures of the area where Harold's farm was located. The landscape looked beautiful in the photos. Rolling hills, wide open spaces, and big sky that seemed to go on forever. It was nothing like the crowded city neighborhood where they currently lived. The more he thought about it, the more the idea grew on him. What if they could make a fresh start? Sure, the house needed work, but David was handy with tools. He'd learned basic construction and repair skills out of necessity over the years. Maybe he could fix up the property and sell it for enough to change their lives. But first, he needed to see it with his own eyes. David had exactly 1 week of vacation time saved up from the factory. He'd been planning to use it if one of the kids got sick, but this felt like an emergency of a different kind. An opportunity that might not come again. He called the lawyer back the next morning during his lunch break. "I want to come look at the property," David said. "Can you arrange for me to get access?" "Of course, Mr. Johnson. When were you thinking of making the trip?" "This weekend. I'll drive out with my kids." The lawyer gave him directions and the location of a key hidden on the property. Harold had apparently been the type of person who didn't trust banks or safety deposit boxes. Everything was kept simple and old-fashioned. David spent the rest of the week making preparations. He arranged to borrow his neighbor's more reliable car, since his own vehicle probably wouldn't make the 400-mile drive. He explained to his boss that he had a family emergency and needed to use his vacation days. He even bought a cooler and packed sandwiches for the road trip, turning it into an adventure for the kids. Friday evening, as they loaded their borrowed car with clothes for the weekend, Sophie asked the question that had been weighing on David's mind, too. "Dad, what if the house is really nice? Could we actually move there?" David looked at his daughter's hopeful face and felt a mixture of excitement and terror. Moving to Montana would mean leaving everything familiar behind. New schools for the kids, a new job for him, and no safety net of friends or familiar places. But it would also mean a chance to start over, to maybe build something better than the paycheck-to-paycheck existence they'd been trapped in. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly. "Let's go see what Uncle Harold left us, and then we'll figure out what comes next." As they drove out of the city Saturday morning, David watched the familiar streets disappear in his rearview mirror. He had no idea that this trip would change everything, or that the complications the lawyer had mentioned were far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. All he knew was that for the first time in 2 years, he felt something that had been missing from his life. Hope. The GPS had stopped working about an hour ago, somewhere around the point where cell phone towers became scarce and the landscape turned into endless rolling hills. David gripped the steering wheel tighter as they bounced along a dirt road that seemed to lead to absolutely nowhere. Sophie and Tommy had their faces pressed against the windows, watching the scenery change from small towns to complete wilderness. "Are we lost, Dad?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying just a hint of worry. "No, buddy. The lawyer said the road gets pretty rough out here. We're looking for a big mailbox with the number 47 on it." They'd been driving for almost 6 hours, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks. The kids had been troopers, entertaining themselves with road trip games and the snacks David had packed. But now, as the sun started getting lower in the sky, even their patience was wearing thin. "There," Sophie pointed ahead. "I see a mailbox." Sure enough, there was a weathered metal mailbox leaning slightly to one side, with faded numbers that might have been 47. David turned onto what could generously be called a driveway, really just 2 tire tracks with grass growing between them. The first thing they saw was the house, and David's heart sank. The lawyer had warned him that it needed work, but this was worse than he'd imagined. The farmhouse looked like something from a horror movie. Half the roof was missing shingles, several windows were boarded up with plywood, and the front porch sagged like it might collapse at any moment. Weeds had grown so tall around the foundation that they nearly reached the first-floor windows. "Wow," Tommy whispered. "It looks like a haunted house." David parked the car and sat for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just a fixer-upper, this was a complete disaster. Any dreams he'd had of selling the property for a decent amount of money evaporated instantly. Who would want to buy this mess? "Come on, kids," he said, trying to keep his voice upbeat. "Let's go explore." They climbed out of the car, and immediately David noticed something strange. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet he'd expected in the middle of nowhere. There was an underlying soundtrack of sounds he couldn't quite identify. Distant bleating, chirping, and what sounded like, "Was that a rooster?" Sophie grabbed his hand as they walked toward the house. "Dad, do you hear that?" "Yeah, I hear it too. Must be wild animals or something." The key was exactly where the lawyer had said it would be, under a loose board on the front porch. David unlocked the door and pushed it open, immediately hit by the smell of dust and abandonment. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating a living room frozen in time. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, and there were stacks of newspapers from years ago scattered on tables. "This place gives me the creeps," Sophie said. Staying close to David's side, they explored the inside quickly. The house was bigger than it looked from outside, with 4 bedrooms and a kitchen that must have been nice once upon a time. But everything needed work. The floors creaked dangerously, the wallpaper was peeling, and there were water stains on most of the ceilings. David tried turning on lights, but the electricity had apparently been shut off long ago. "At least the bones are good," David muttered to himself, trying to stay positive. The foundation seemed solid, and the layout was actually pretty nice. With enough work and money, a lot of money, this could be a beautiful home. But as they walked around outside, those mysterious animal sounds kept getting louder. They seemed to be coming from behind the house, where David could see several old barns and outbuildings scattered across the property. "Can we go look at the barns, Dad?" Tommy asked, his earlier fear replaced by curiosity. "Sure. But stay close to me." They walked toward the first barn, a large red structure that looked like it was in better shape than the house. As they got closer, the sounds became unmistakable. These weren't wild animals. These were farm animals, lots of them. David pulled open the heavy barn door and couldn't believe what he saw. The barn was full of goats. Not just a few goats, dozens of them. They looked up at the unexpected visitors with curious eyes, some bleating a greeting. Most looked healthy and well-fed, which was impossible since Harold had been dead for 3 years. "Oh my gosh, Dad! Look at all the goats!" Sophie squealed with delight. Tommy was already trying to pet the closest one through the fence. "They're so cute! Can we keep them?" David stood there, stunned. Who was feeding these animals? How were they still alive? And more importantly, how many more were there? They moved to the next building, a long chicken coop that was practically vibrating with the sound of clucking and squawking. Inside were more chickens than David had ever seen in one place. Different breeds, different colors, all apparently healthy and happy. Automatic feeders lined the walls, and David could see that water was flowing through some kind of system that kept their containers full. "This is like a zoo," Tommy exclaimed, running ahead to the next building. The third barn contained pigs, huge pink pigs that grunted and snorted when they saw the visitors. Beyond that was a paddock with horses, beautiful horses that trotted over to the fence as if they were used to people visiting. But it was the fourth building that made David's jaw drop completely. As they approached, he heard sounds he definitely hadn't expected, exotic bird calls that belonged in a jungle, not rural Montana. Inside, they found an enormous aviary filled with tropical birds of every color imaginable. Parrots, macaws, toucans, and species David couldn't even name flew around in a space that had been specially designed for them. "Dad, this is amazing," Sophie breathed, watching a bright blue parrot land near the viewing window. David was starting to feel overwhelmed. Each building they explored revealed more animals: sheep, llamas, peacocks strutting around like they owned the place, and even what looked like a couple of zebras in a distant pasture. "How is this possible?" he muttered, more to himself than to the kids. They spent the next hour exploring the property, finding animals everywhere they looked. Behind one of the smaller buildings, Tommy discovered a pond with ducks and geese. Near the house, Sophie found a vegetable garden that was somehow still producing food, with an automatic sprinkler system keeping everything watered. The numbers were staggering. David tried to count as they went, but gave up after reaching 500 animals. There had to be thousands of creatures living on this property. All of them looked healthy, all of them seemed well cared for, and all of them appeared to be completely dependent on systems that Harold had built before his death. "Dad, how are they all still alive?" Sophie asked the question that was burning in David's mind. Before he could answer, they heard a car engine approaching. David instinctively put his arms around his kids, not sure what to expect. A pickup truck pulled up to the house, and a woman in her 40s got out. She wore work clothes and boots and carried herself like someone who spent a lot of time around animals. "You must be Harold's nephew," she called out, walking toward them with a friendly smile. "I'm Dr. Amy Peterson. I've been taking care of Harold's animals since he passed." David felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone who could explain what was going on. "I can't believe all these animals are still here," David said. "How have you been managing this by yourself?" Dr. Peterson laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I haven't been doing it alone, but it's been incredibly difficult. Harold set up amazing systems: automatic feeders, water systems, even heating for the more exotic animals. But they need constant maintenance, medical care, and someone to monitor them every single day." She gestured toward the barns. Harold spent his entire life savings creating this place. He rescued animals that nobody else wanted. Older farm animals, injured wildlife, exotic pets that people abandoned. He couldn't bear to see any creature suffer. "But there must be thousands of them," David said. 2,537 to be exact, Dr. Peterson replied. "I've been keeping count, hoping someone would take over the sanctuary legally. A few volunteers and I have been using our own money to keep them fed, but we're running out of resources fast." David felt like someone had just dropped a building on him. He'd come here hoping to find a house he could fix up and sell. Instead, he'd inherited what was essentially a massive animal sanctuary that required full-time care and enormous amounts of money to maintain. "What happens if nobody takes over?" he asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Dr. Peterson's expression grew serious. "The county will eventually force us to remove them. Most will have to be. Well, let's just say there aren't many places that can take this many animals, especially the older and disabled ones Harold specialized in rescuing." Sophie had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. "You mean they might hurt the animals?" "Sophie," David said gently, "it's complicated." But his daughter's eyes were already filling with tears. "We can't let anything happen to them, Dad. Look at them. They're so sweet and innocent." Tommy nodded vigorously. "We have to save them." David looked around at the property with new eyes. What had seemed like a nightmare inheritance a few hours ago now felt like something much more complex. These weren't just animals. They were Harold's life work, a legacy of compassion that had somehow survived 3 years after his death through the dedication of a few volunteers. "How much does it cost to keep this place running?" David asked Dr. Peterson. "About $15,000 a month minimum. That's just for food, basic medical care, and maintaining the automatic systems. Major repairs or emergencies cost extra. David did quick math in his head. $15,000 a month was more than he made at both his jobs combined. This was impossible. Completely, utterly impossible. But as he watched his kids fall in love with a gentle old horse that had wandered over to the fence, David realized that sometimes impossible things had a way of becoming possible when people cared enough to make them work. The question was, did he care enough to try? That night, David barely slept. They'd found a small motel about 20 miles away, the only accommodation within reasonable driving distance of Harold's property. The kids had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from their day of exploration and animal encounters. But David lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with numbers that didn't add up and decisions that seemed impossible to make. $15,000 a month. The number kept spinning in his head like a broken record. He made maybe $3,000 a month at both his jobs combined. Even if he could somehow find work in rural Montana that paid the same, he'd need to earn 5 times more just to keep the animals fed. At 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep and sat by the window, looking out at the dark landscape. In a few hours, he'd have to drive back to the sanctuary with Dr. Peterson and make some kind of decision about what would happen to all those animals. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. He thought about Sophie's face when she'd seen the goats, how her whole expression had lit up with pure joy. Tommy had spent an hour trying to teach the old horse to shake hands, giggling every time the gentle giant nuzzled his palm looking for treats. His kids had never shown that kind of uninhibited happiness around animals before. They'd never had the chance. But what kind of father would he be if he dragged his children into a situation that was guaranteed to fail? Moving to Montana would mean leaving behind their school, their friends, their entire support system. And for what? To watch a beautiful dream collapse under the weight of financial reality? The next morning, Dr. Peterson met them at the property with coffee and donuts, looking like she hadn't slept much either. She also brought along 2 other people, an elderly man named Frank, who helped with the larger animals, and a college student named Lily who specialized in caring for the exotic birds. "I wanted you to meet the other volunteers," Dr. Peterson explained as they walked toward the barns. "We've been talking all night about your situation." Frank, who must have been in his 70s, moved around the animals with the ease of someone who'd been doing this work his whole life. "Harold and I were friends for 30 years, he said, scratching behind the ears of a massive pig that seemed to adore him. This place was his life's work. "Every single animal here has a story." He pointed to a 3-legged goat grazing peacefully in a nearby pen. "That's Patches. Harold rescued her from a farm where they were going to put her down because of her disability. She's been here 8 years now, happier than any goat I've ever seen." Lily, the college student, led them to the exotic bird sanctuary. "Most of these birds lived in tiny cages before Harold saved them," she explained, watching a beautiful red parrot perch on her shoulder. "Tropical birds can live for decades, sometimes over 100 years. If this place closes, finding homes for all of them would be nearly impossible." David could see what they were doing, showing him that these weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Every animal had a face, a personality, a story of rescue and recovery. It was emotional manipulation, but it was also completely genuine. These people truly cared about Harold's legacy. "I understand what you're trying to show me," David said finally. "But caring about something and being able to afford it are 2 different things. I work in a factory and stock shelves at night. I don't know anything about running a sanctuary." Dr. Peterson nodded. Harold didn't know anything about it either when he started. He was a retired accountant who inherited some money and decided to help animals. He learned as he went. "Yeah, but Harold had money. I have about $300 in my savings account." "Actually," Dr. Peterson said carefully, "that's something we need to talk about." Harold left detailed records of everything he did here. Frank and I spent yesterday going through his files. She led them to Harold's office in the house, a room lined with filing cabinets and notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting. "Your great-uncle was incredibly organized. He documented every animal rescue, every expense, every improvement he made to the property." Frank pulled out a thick folder. "The interesting thing is, Harold was smarter about this than we realized. Some of these animals are actually quite valuable." David raised an eyebrow. "Valuable how?" "Heritage breeds," Lily explained. Harold had a thing for saving rare livestock that was in danger of disappearing. Some of his sheep and pigs are from bloodlines that zoos and conservation programs pay good money for. Dr. Peterson showed him a list of numbers that made David's eyes widen. Conservative estimates suggest that breeding rights and sales to legitimate conservation programs could generate about $8,000 a month. Not enough to cover all expenses, but a significant start. Plus, Frank added, Harold set up the infrastructure really well. The automatic feeding systems, the water pumps, the shelter designs, they're all incredibly efficient. He spent years perfecting them. David felt a tiny spark of hope, but quickly pushed it down. Even if that's true, I still need to feed my family and pay for a place to live. I can't just abandon everything and move here on a maybe. What if it wasn't just a maybe? Dr. Peterson asked. What if there was a way to make this work financially? She pulled out another folder, this one filled with newspaper clippings and printouts from websites. Agritourism is huge in Montana. People pay good money to visit working farms, learn about animals, and experience rural life. Harold never pursued that because he was too private, but the location and setup here are perfect for it. Lily nodded enthusiastically. Educational programs, weekend visitors, summer camps for kids, there's so much potential here. David looked around the office, taking in the scope of Harold's documentation. His great-uncle had clearly been brilliant at organization and planning. Maybe these people were right that there was potential here. But potential didn't pay bills. Even if all of that worked, David said, I'd need money to get started. Money to move here, money to live on while we're getting established, money for all the licenses and permits you'd need for a business like this. The room went quiet. David could see the disappointment in their faces, and it made him feel terrible. These people had been pouring their hearts and their own money into keeping Harold's dream alive, and he was the practical reality check that was about to end it all. Sophie and Tommy had been quietly exploring the office while the adults talked. Suddenly, Tommy spoke up from where he was looking through a photo album. Dad, look at this. The album was filled with pictures of Harold with various animals over the years. But what caught David's attention were the newspaper clippings mixed in between the photos. Headlines like Local Man Creates Haven for Unwanted Animals and Retired Accountant Saves Hundreds of Creatures. Harold was kind of famous, Sophie observed, reading over Tommy's shoulder. Dr. Peterson smiled. He hated the attention, but yes, the story got picked up by several news outlets over the years. People are fascinated by this kind of work. What are you thinking? David asked, seeing a look in her eye. Social media, she said simply. If people knew what was happening here, if they could see these animals and understand Harold's mission, I think you'd be surprised how much support you might get. Frank nodded. Harold never wanted publicity, but that doesn't mean it couldn't work. People love animal rescue stories. David felt torn between hope and fear. The more they talked, the more possible it seemed. But possible and practical were still two different things. He thought about his tiny apartment back home, his 2 jobs that barely covered expenses, the constant stress of never having enough money. Then he looked at his kids, who were now sitting on the floor looking through more of Harold's photo albums. They looked more relaxed and happy than he'd seen them in months. If I did this, David said slowly, if I actually tried to make this work, what would that look like? Dr. Peterson's eyes lit up. Well, first you'd need to establish legal ownership and get the proper permits for operating a sanctuary. Then we'd need to assess the immediate needs, which animals need medical attention, what repairs are most urgent. The house would need to be livable, Frank added. Basic electrical and plumbing repairs at minimum. And we'd need to start generating income quickly, Lily said. The heritage breeding program could start immediately, and we could begin planning the agritourism side. David's head was spinning. It was an enormous undertaking, full of unknowns and financial risks. If it failed, he'd be worse off than when he started. But if it succeeded, how long do I have to decide? He asked. Dr. Peterson's expression grew serious. The county inspector is coming next month. If there's no legal owner taking responsibility for the animals by then, they'll have to be removed. We've been buying time, but it's running out. David looked around Harold's office one more time, then out the window at the barns where thousands of animals were living peacefully, trusting that somehow their care would continue. I need to think about this, he said finally. Can you give me until tomorrow morning? That evening, back at the motel, David sat down with Sophie and Tommy for the most important conversation of their lives. Kids, I need to ask you something serious. How would you feel about moving here permanently? Sophie's eyes went wide. Really? We could live with all the animals? It wouldn't be easy, David warned. We'd have to leave everything behind and start over, and there's no guarantee it would work out. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then asked, What happens to the animals if we don't stay? David couldn't bring himself to explain the full reality to a 6-year-old. They'd have to find new homes. But Dr. Peterson said that would be really hard, right? David nodded. Sophie took Tommy's hand. Dad, those animals need us. And maybe we need them too. Looking at his children's faces, David realized that sometimes the most important decisions aren't about money or practicality. Sometimes they're about faith, courage, and the belief that love can overcome impossible odds. The question was, did he have enough faith to take the leap? The moving truck looked ridiculously small, parked next to the farmhouse. Everything David owned fit into one medium-sized truck. Furniture from their tiny apartment, clothes, toys, and a few boxes of memories. As he watched the movers unload their life onto the sagging front porch, David wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. It had been 3 weeks since that conversation at the motel. 3 weeks of phone calls, paperwork, sleepless nights, and the hardest decision he'd ever made. He'd quit both his jobs, sold everything he couldn't take with him, and borrowed money against the property just to cover the moving expenses and first month's bills for the animals. Sophie and Tommy ran around the property like they owned the place, reacquainting themselves with animals they'd fallen in love with during their first visit. Their excitement was the only thing keeping David from having a complete panic attack. The electricals should be working by this afternoon, Dr. Peterson said, checking items off a long to-do list. And Frank got the water pump fixed yesterday. David nodded, trying to focus on practical matters instead of the voice in his head that kept asking what he'd done. The house was barely livable even with basic utilities. Half the rooms had holes in the ceiling, the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and the heating system was held together with duct tape and prayers. But it was theirs now. For better or worse, Dad, come quick! Tommy's voice carried across the yard, high-pitched with excitement. David followed the sound to one of the smaller barns, where he found his son crouched next to a pen containing what looked like miniature horses. Dr. Peterson says these are ponies, and this one is pregnant, Tommy announced, pointing to a gentle brown mare with a noticeably round belly. Her name is Buttercup, Dr. Peterson explained, joining them. She's due any day now. Harold rescued her from a situation where she wasn't getting proper prenatal care. David watched Buttercup nuzzle Tommy's outstretched hand and felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in years, his kids were experiencing pure joy on a daily basis. That had to count for something. The first month was harder than anything David had ever experienced. Every morning started at 5 a.m. with feeding routines that took 2 hours to complete. Dr. Peterson had left detailed instructions, but learning to care for over 2,000 animals was like trying to drink from a fire hose. The heritage sheep needed special grain. The exotic birds required specific fruits and vegetables. The pigs had individual dietary restrictions based on age and health conditions. The horses needed their hooves checked daily, and that was just the beginning. Frank, the elderly volunteer, became David's lifeline. Despite being in his 70s, Frank worked circles around David, teaching him everything from how to properly mix feed to recognizing signs of illness in different species. Harold used to say that every animal is an individual, Frank explained one morning as they checked on a group of rescued goats. That one there with the black spot on her head, she's diabetic. Needs insulin twice a day. The brown one next to her gets anxious during thunderstorms and needs extra attention. David's head spun with all the information he needed to learn. How had Harold managed all this alone for so many years? The answer came when David started going through more of Harold's records. His great-uncle had been incredibly systematic, keeping detailed files on every animal's medical history, dietary needs, and behavioral quirks. He'd also documented years of trial and error in designing efficient care systems. Look at this, David showed Dr. Peterson a notebook filled with Harold's sketches. He designed automatic feeding systems that could handle different dietary requirements for different animals. And these water systems, they're genius. Dr. Peterson smiled. Harold was always tinkering with ways to make the work more efficient. He said the animals deserved the best care possible, but he was only one person. By the end of the first month, David had lost 15 pounds and gained a deep appreciation for his great-uncle's dedication. But he'd also started to see possibilities that Harold's solitary nature had prevented him from exploring. The breakthrough came when Sophie suggested they start filming their daily routines. Kids at school never believe me when I tell them about the animals, she said one evening at dinner. Can we make videos to show them? David was exhausted and stressed about money, but something about Sophie's suggestion sparked an idea. That weekend, he borrowed a decent camera from Dr. Peterson and started filming their daily activities. The first video was simple. Tommy helping feed the baby goats while providing running commentary in his 6-year-old voice about each animal's personality. David posted it on a social media account he created called Henderson Family Farm without expecting much response. Within a week, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. "Dad, look at all these comments," Sophie squealed, reading responses on David's phone. "People love the animals." The comments were overwhelmingly positive. People shared stories about their own rescued pets, asked questions about the different species, and expressed amazement at the scale of Harold's sanctuary. "This is beautiful," one comment read. "My kids and I watch this every day now. It's like having our own farm to visit. More videos, please," wrote another. "This is the most wholesome content on the internet." Dr. Peterson was amazed by the response. Harold always avoided publicity, but look at how people are responding to this. They want to be part of what you're doing here. Encouraged by the positive feedback, David started posting regularly. Videos of morning feeding routines, of Sophie reading stories to the animals, of Tommy's ongoing friendship with Buttercup the pregnant pony. Each video gained more viewers than the last. Then came the message that changed everything. "Hi, David," the email read. "I'm a producer for a morning show that features heartwarming human interest stories. We'd love to do a segment about your family and the animal sanctuary. Would you be interested in talking?" David stared at the email for a long time before showing it to the kids. "They want to put us on TV," Tommy asked, eyes wide. "It could help people learn about what we're doing here," Sophie added thoughtfully. The TV segment aired on a Tuesday morning in October. David had been nervous about being on camera, but the interviewer focused on the animals and Harold's story. They filmed Sophie helping with the morning feeding, Tommy playing with the goats, and David explaining how they'd inherited this incredible responsibility. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the segment airing, David's phone was ringing constantly. People wanted to visit the sanctuary, to volunteer, to donate money for animal care. "We've never had anything like this," Dr. Peterson said, helping David sort through emails. "Look at this. A school group wants to arrange a field trip. This couple wants to get married here, and this woman is offering to donate $1,000 a month to help with feed costs." But the most important call came from an unexpected source. "Mr. Johnson, this is Professor Williams from the State University's Agriculture Program. We've been following your story, and we're wondering if you'd be interested in partnering with our veterinary students for a practicum program." The professor explained that veterinary students needed real-world experience with large-scale animal care, and Harold's Sanctuary would provide an ideal learning environment. In exchange for hands-on education, the students would provide free veterinary care for the animals. That could save us thousands of dollars a month in medical expenses. Dr. Peterson calculated after David hung up the phone. The momentum kept building. A local newspaper wrote a feature story about the sanctuary that got picked up by national outlets. A documentary filmmaker reached out about creating a longer piece about Harold's legacy and David's journey. Most importantly, visitors started coming. Families drove hours to meet the animals and hear their rescue stories. School groups booked educational tours. Wedding photographers discovered that the property made a stunning backdrop. "I think we need to formalize the visiting program," David told Dr. Peterson one evening as they watched a family from 3 states away say goodbye to the animals they'd spent the afternoon meeting. "You mean like official tours?" Exactly. Harold built something amazing here, but he never shared it with the world. People want to be part of this. They want to support it. By winter, David had established regular visiting hours, educational programs for school groups, and a small gift shop in Harold's old workshop that sold products made from the sanctuary's wool and eggs. The numbers started adding up in ways David had never imagined possible. Tour fees, educational programs, product sales, and donations were generating enough income to cover most of the animals' care costs. The heritage breeding program was producing additional revenue from zoos and conservation programs interested in Harold's rare bloodlines. "We're actually making this work," David said to Frank one snowy December morning as they checked on the animals. Frank smiled, scratching behind the ears of an old pig that had become his special companion. Harold would be amazed. He loved these animals, but he never dreamed that sharing their stories could help save them. As David watched his children help with the morning routine, a task they now performed with the confidence of experienced farm hands, he realized that they hadn't just saved Harold's sanctuary. The sanctuary had saved them too. Sophie had grown confident and responsible, taking leadership roles in the educational programs. Tommy had found his calling working with the gentler animals, showing a natural intuition for their needs and moods. And David had discovered something he'd never known about himself, that he had the courage to build something meaningful from nothing, one day at a time. But the real test was still coming. They'd proven they could attract visitors and generate interest. The question now was whether they could sustain and grow what they'd built. Construction on Harold's Education Center began that spring. The design incorporated his original vision with modern sustainability features and accessibility considerations. Solar panels would power the building, rainwater collection would support the gardens, and wheelchair-accessible paths would ensure everyone could participate in programs. As David watched the foundation being poured for the center that would carry Harold's name, he thought about how far they'd all come. Sophie was now homeschooled, so she could focus on developing educational curricula for visiting schools. Tommy had started a junior naturalist program for other kids interested in animal care. Dr. Peterson had been offered positions at prestigious veterinary colleges, but chose to stay and help build something unique. "You know what the best part is?" David said to Frank as they watched a group of visitors saying goodbye to their favorite animals. "What's that?" "Every single animal Harold saved is still here. Every creature he thought was worth rescuing has lived to see this place become something even bigger than his dreams." Frank smiled, scratching behind the ears of the old pig who had become his constant companion. Harold used to say that broken things could be beautiful if someone cared enough to fix them properly. David looked around at the thriving sanctuary, at his confident and happy children, at the community of people who had rallied around Harold's vision. The worthless farmhouse had indeed been worthless as a piece of real estate. But as the foundation for a life built on compassion, purpose, and the belief that every creature deserved care and respect, it had become the most valuable inheritance anyone could ask for. That evening, as the sun set over the Montana hills and the animals settled in for the night, David stood on the porch of the house that had once seemed like a disaster. The same sounds that had confused and overwhelmed him 2 years ago now provided a peaceful symphony. The gentle sounds of thousands of creatures living safely because one man had cared enough to save them, and because his family had found the courage to carry that mission forward. Sometimes the most important gifts come disguised as impossible problems, and sometimes the best way to save yourself is to dedicate your life to saving others. 2 years after that first terrifying night in the rundown farmhouse, David woke up to a sound he'd never expected to hear. The gentle hum of a place that was actually working. Through his bedroom window, he could see the morning mist rising over pastures where hundreds of animals grazed peacefully. The old farmhouse had been transformed into a comfortable home, complete with a new roof, updated plumbing, and a kitchen that could handle feeding a family of 3, plus the steady stream of volunteers who had become like extended family. The alarm clock read 5:30 a.m., but David was already awake, not from stress or worry like in the old days, but from excitement about another day at what had become officially known as Henderson Heritage Sanctuary. The name honored both Harold's original vision and the new direction David's family had taken it. "Morning, Dad," Sophie called from downstairs. At 10 years old, she had become the sanctuary's unofficial social media manager, photographer, and tour guide. Her natural ability to connect with both animals and people had made her a local celebrity of sorts. "Tommy's already outside with the baby goats," she continued. "And Dr. Peterson says Buttercup's daughter is ready to start training with visitors today." David smiled, pulling on his work clothes. Buttercup had given birth to a healthy filly just 6 months after they'd moved to the farm. Tommy had named her Sunshine, and she'd become something of a mascot for the sanctuary. Now, almost 2 years later, Sunshine was old enough to participate in the Gentle Interaction, programs that had become one of their most popular attractions. The morning routine, that had once seemed impossible, now flowed like a well-choreographed dance. David, his kids, Dr. Peterson, Frank, and a rotating crew of college students from the veterinary program worked together to feed, water, and check on all 2,500-plus animals. What had taken Harold hours to do alone now happened efficiently with their team approach. "The Martinez family is coming back today," Sophie announced as they walked toward the first barn. "Remember them? They were here for their daughter's birthday last month. Mrs. Martinez said Sophia hasn't stopped talking about the baby pigs since then." David did remember. The Martinez family had driven 4 hours from Denver just to spend a day at the sanctuary. Their daughter Sophia had a disability that made it difficult for her to connect with peers. But she'd spent hours contentedly sitting with the gentler animals, finding a peace that amazed her parents. "That's what this place is really about," David thought as he watched Tommy carefully measure feed for the heritage sheep. It wasn't just about saving animals anymore. It was about creating connections between people and creatures that healed both sides. The transformation hadn't been easy. That first winter had tested everyone's resolve. When the heating system for the exotic bird sanctuary failed during a blizzard, David had spent 3 days living in the aviary with space heaters, making sure the tropical birds stayed warm. When Buttercup had complications during her pregnancy, Dr. Peterson had practically moved into the barn for a week. But each challenge had brought the community closer together. Local businesses started donating supplies. The state university expanded their partnership to include agriculture and environmental science students. A nearby town began routing tourist buses through the sanctuary as part of their heritage tour packages. "Dad, come look at this!" Sophie waved him over to where she was checking the sanctuary's social media accounts on her tablet. "The video of Tommy teaching Sunshine to shake hands has over 2 million views." David shook his head in amazement. Harold had created this place as a private refuge, never imagining that it would become a destination that attracted visitors from around the world. The sanctuary's social media presence had grown to include educational content about conservation, behind-the-scenes looks at animal care, and heartwarming stories about individual rescues. "Oh, and the documentary crew confirmed they'll be here next week," Sophie added. "They want to film the segment about Harold's original journals and how we use them for animal care." The documentary, tentatively titled Harold's Legacy When Love Saves Lives, was being produced by a team that specialized in conservation stories. They'd been following the sanctuary's journey for 6 months, documenting not just the daily operations, but the broader impact on wildlife conservation and community education. "Speaking of Harold," Frank called from across the yard, "I found something interesting in his workshop yesterday." Frank led them to Harold's old workshop, which had been converted into the sanctuary's visitor center and gift shop. Behind a stack of old feed bags, he'd discovered a metal box containing more of Harold's journals and what appeared to be architectural drawings. "Look at this," Frank said, spreading out the papers. Harold had plans for expanding the sanctuary. He dreamed of building a proper veterinary clinic, an education center, and specialized habitats for rehabilitation of injured wildlife. David studied the detailed drawings. Harold had envisioned something much larger than what he'd been able to achieve alone. The plan showed careful thought about animal welfare, visitor education, and environmental sustainability. He was thinking 30 years ahead, Dr. Peterson observed, examining Harold's notes about climate change adaptation and native species conservation. Some of these ideas are just now becoming standard practice in modern wildlife management. Maybe it's time we started thinking about Phase 2, David said quietly. The idea had been growing in his mind for months. The sanctuary was now financially stable, with multiple revenue streams from tours, educational programs, heritage breeding, and product sales. They'd paid off the back taxes and built up a small emergency fund. More importantly, they'd proven that Harold's vision could work on a larger scale. "What are you thinking?" Dr. Peterson asked. "Harold's Education Center," David said, pointing to the drawings. "We could build it. Not exactly like his plans, but adapted for what we've learned about what people need and want." Sophie's eyes lit up. "You mean like a real classroom where schools could come for overnight programs? And a proper veterinary clinic where we could treat not just our animals, but injured wildlife from the whole region," Dr. Peterson added, catching the vision. Tommy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "And maybe a place where other kids like me who don't have farms could come. Learn about taking care of animals." David felt that familiar flutter of excitement mixed with terror that had become his signal for recognizing a good idea. "It would be a huge project. We'd need permits, funding, construction crews." "We'd need to do it right," Frank agreed. "But Harold left us more than just animals. He left us a community of people who believe in this work." Over the next few months, David began reaching out to that community. The response was overwhelming. Former visitors offered to volunteer their professional skills. Local businesses pledged materials and services. The university proposed expanding their partnership to include research programs and student internships. The State Conservation Department expressed interest in using the expanded sanctuary as a rehabilitation center for injured native wildlife. A national foundation focused on agricultural education offered a significant grant for the education center construction. "It's like Harold's vision is finally finding the resources it always needed," Dr. Peterson said one evening as they reviewed architectural plans for the education center. But the most meaningful moment came when Tommy approached David with a carefully written letter. "Want to send this to the foundation," Tommy said. "I wrote about why the sanctuary is important." David read his 8-year-old son's letter, which explained in simple terms how the animals had taught him about responsibility, kindness, and caring for things that couldn't care for themselves. It ended with, "My dad says we saved the animals, but I think they saved us too." The letter became part of their grant application, and according to the foundation director, it was the deciding factor in approving their funding request.